Hey, Lake Point, Pastor Michael here to get you caught up on the 6th week of our series of Free Humanity. In this series, we're looking at Paul's letter to the churches in Galatia. And this week, our guest, Pastor Luch Lombardi, talked all about division. Now, don't panic, he didn't talk about mathematics, but rather he talked about the things that divide us as a community. And as Luch pointed out, it's often the very things we think make us right with God that divide us. For many of us, there are things we believe we need to do or accomplish in order to obtain God's approval. And when we think our relationship with God is dependent upon our behavior, all we end up doing is creating a distance between us and other people. In Galatians chapter 2, verses 11 to 16, Paul relays a story to the Galatian church about a time when Peter had come up to visit Paul in the city of Antioch. Now, what makes the city of Antioch unique is that it was actually the first city that had a church made up of both Jewish and Gentile believers. And although Peter had been preaching the inclusion of Gentiles in the church, when he arrived in Antioch, he started acting pretty hypocritical to the gospel he had been preaching. This is what we read. It says, "When Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. The other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray. When I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter in front of all of them, 'You are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? We who are Jews by birth and not sinful Gentiles know that a person is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. So we too have put our faith in Christ Jesus, that we may be justified by faith in Christ and not by the works of the law, because by the works of the law, no one will be justified.'" Now, you might be a little confused with that passage, but basically what happened was Peter was eating freely with everyone until a group of Jews from Judea show up, and so Peter starts eating only with other Jewish people. And this has Paul ticked. Paul's like, "Yo, Peter, what's with this charade? Like, you know as well as I know that it's Jesus plus nothing. That's the gospel. It's not Jesus plus the law. So why are you acting like there's a separation between the Gentiles and the Jewish believers? Why are you saying the Gentiles need to act like Jews?" The reality is, Peter, like many of us, got focused on the wrong things. Peter was influenced by the peer pressure that emerged during the visit of those imposters. Their belief was that the good news is that Christ has delivered us from evil, and so we must also follow the law to be a part of God's community. Law keeping was included by the imposters as a necessary saving element. Back in Jerusalem, Peter had recently got out of jail because he had been challenging this very belief. And so he heads to Antioch to let things kind of cool down a bit. But surely when he saw those imposters show up, who were most likely sent there to spy on him, Peter kind of succumbs to the peer pressure and he demonstrates the hypocritical act of eating exclusively with Jews. What's also interesting is that Paul points out that the historical reality is that even as Jews, he and Peter were aware that the relationship with God was always based on trust and not on law keeping. Paul says to things like, "We have been brought up godly and not pagans. We still know that as individuals, it's not how we were put right with God by keeping the law, but rather through faith in Jesus Christ." He also says no human being will be put right by the law. In fact, Paul tells Peter that this goes all the way back to Abraham's story. It was always about trust, not rule keeping. However, over the centuries, the Jewish faith was challenged by pagan nations. And as the Jewish religious views were continually challenged by pagan nations, focus was put on the outward aspects of their faith, such as Sabbath keeping, kosher food, circumcision, and other practices. And so it led to the Jews wanting to protect those traditions so that they could live differently than other people. As Luch shared, over time, the things that were challenged became more important to the Jewish people than the faith that those things represented. By the time we get to the period of the appearance of Jesus and the emergence of the Christian community, the Jewish faith had solidified itself on the outward elements of being exhibited and protected by the Jews at all costs, even to the detriment of bringing life. Paul wants the Galatian Christians to know that the law does not actually have the power to save them. Committing your life to law keeping only opens the door to evil, to hypocrisy, to legalism, to control, and to the elimination of freedom altogether. To focus on law keeping is to break relationship with God and to focus on your relationship with other things, which just promotes evil in our lives because those other things end up taking control over our lives. And so, what do we do about it? How do we stop the division and live out the true gospel? Well, we keep our focus on Christ. The reality about holiness is that it is a byproduct of a relationship with the Trinity. And in fact, our holiness was accomplished by Christ before we were even created. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 4, which was also written by Paul, reads, "The Father chose us in Christ before the foundation of the world was put in place to be holy and blameless in His sight." Paul makes it clear that holiness is a byproduct of being in relationship with Christ, and our relationship with Christ was established by the Father before we even existed. You want to be holy? Focus on Jesus. Breathe in His words, His person, His love, His hope, and His peace. The next question is, well, how do we remain holy without just following rules? Well, the key to avoiding the destructive behaviors is to die to them altogether. In Galatians 2, verse 20, Paul writes, "I was crucified. It's not me that lives any longer, but Christ living in me. I now live in my present humanity by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave Himself for me." Jesus came to deal with the distorted way we have gone about establishing a relationship with God and with the world around us. We have lived a humanity of rigid requirements and fixation on things to appease evil and keep it at bay. Jesus has destroyed all that at the cross. And because of that, we can live in full dependence on the Spirit that the Son and the Father have given us. Rather than deal with evil when it is present by establishing more laws and requirements, we can now ask the Spirit to help us, give us insight, give us wisdom and knowledge that promotes healthy relationships and a healthy environment. The Spirit helps us focus on what we can now become because of our deliverance from evil. So, how do we eliminate the division that emerges within our community, within our churches? Well, according to Paul and Luch, there's a few things. One, don't let the legalism of others intimidate you. Confront it. Two, get rid of the legalistic rules that stifle the good news and the growth and freedom in others. And three, don't take your eyes off of God. You know, so often we put our eyes on ourselves and each other, but we need to keep our eyes focused on Jesus. Well, friends, consider yourselves caught up. Enjoy diving into discussion questions. I'll see you next time.